Welcome once again to another focus on African leadership. In this episode, we are looking at breaking the shackles. What African leaders must do to secure the continent's progress and end Western dominance. Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people and vast natural wealth, stands at a historic crossroads. Despite its rich resources, youthful population, and growing potential, Africa remains trapped in cycles of underdevelopment, economic dependence, political instability, and foreign manipulation, largely shaped by centuries of colonialism and decades of post-independence Western dominance. For Africa to claim the 21st century and build a truly independent, prosperous future, African leaders must embrace a new mindset and pursue bold, self-determined reforms. This article outlines what African leaders must do politically, economically, socially, and technologically to liberate the continent from foreign control and ensure sustainable development. 1. Redefining sovereignty and political independence. Africa's post-independence political structures often mirror those imposed by colonialists. Despite formal sovereignty, most African states remain politically dependent on Western powers through foreign aid, loans, and security arrangements. Key steps: Pan-African unity and stronger regional institutions. African leaders must recommit to Pan-Africanism, strengthening the African Union, AU, and sub-regional bodies, ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, not as ceremonial blocs but as powerful economic and political unions, similar to the EU. Rejecting puppet politics. Leaders must resist being proxies for Western interests. Elections must be decided by citizens, not foreign embassies. African leaders must stop seeking legitimacy from foreign governments and instead build legitimacy from within. De-dollarization of governance decisions. African policies should stop being written in Washington, Paris, or London. The World Bank and IMF's influence on domestic policy must be replaced with homegrown development frameworks. 2. Economic independence, industrialize or perish. Africa's economic model still depends on exporting raw materials and importing finished products, a colonial legacy that sustains Western wealth while impoverishing the continent. Key steps: value addition and manufacturing. African countries must prioritize industrialization. Instead of exporting cocoa, Africa must export chocolate. Instead of lithium, export batteries. Leaders should incentivize local manufacturing and attract African diaspora investors. Continental Free Trade Implementation. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, must move beyond theory to action. Tariff barriers must be removed, infrastructure for intra-African trade developed, and local businesses protected from unfair competition. Resource control and local ownership. African governments must renegotiate exploitative contracts with multinationals and demand majority stakes in resource extraction industries. National wealth must serve national interests. 3. Educational and intellectual liberation. For true independence, Africa must liberate its mind from colonial indoctrination. Africa's education systems continue to promote Eurocentric thinking, sidelining African history, languages, and innovations. Key steps: curriculum reform. African education must be decolonized. Students should learn African history, African philosophy, traditional knowledge systems, and Afrocentric political theory alongside modern sciences. Investing in STEM and R&D. African leaders must fund research institutions, universities, and innovation hubs to build a knowledge economy. No nation can be sovereign while depending on foreign tech. Language as liberation. African languages should be formalized in public administration and schools. Countries like Tanzania and Ethiopia provide examples of strengthening national identity through indigenous languages. 4. Strategic infrastructure development. Infrastructure is the backbone of development, yet most African economies suffer from poor roads, limited energy, and inadequate digital access, often funded and controlled by external actors. Key steps: integrated African infrastructure projects. Leaders must fund cross-border railways, roads, and energy grids through African capital and institutions. This will facilitate intra-African trade and cooperation. Digital sovereignty. African countries must own their data. Instead of relying on American or Chinese cloud servers, the continent should build African-owned data centers, social media platforms, and IT infrastructure. Green industrialization. Africa must lead in renewable energy, not to satisfy Western climate goals, but to power its industrial revolution using its vast solar, wind, and hydro potential. 5. Rejecting neocolonial financial control. The Western financial system, from the Bretton Woods institutions to the CFA franc in Francophone Africa, remains a tool of neocolonial control. Key steps. Monetary sovereignty. Francophone African nations must break away from the CFA franc, a currency still under French treasury control. African nations must explore regional or national currencies, backed by commodities or blockchain technology. African development financing. African leaders must create and strengthen African-owned banks like Afreximbank and the African Development Bank. These should be used for large-scale infrastructure and social investments instead of relying on the World Bank or IMF. Alternative trade partnerships. Leaders must diversify trade partners and build South-South cooperation with BRICS, Latin America, and Asia, reducing reliance on former colonial powers. 6. Combating corruption and internal sabotage. Africa's progress is constantly undermined by internal enemies, corrupt elites, weak institutions, and foreign-aligned actors sabotaging reforms. Key steps. Transparent governance. Leaders must promote digital governance, e-budgeting, and blockchain in procurement to curb theft. Whistleblower protection laws and independent anti-corruption agencies should be empowered. Asset recovery and repatriation. African leaders must track, freeze, and reclaim stolen wealth held in foreign banks. Countries like Nigeria and Kenya have already initiated such moves. It must become continent-wide policy. Patriotic leadership development. Africa needs visionary, servant leaders, not strongmen. The continent must groom leaders driven by the love of the people, not foreign praise or bank accounts in Switzerland. 7. Strategic military sovereignty. Without military self-reliance, political and economic independence is impossible. Western powers retain strong military influence across Africa through bases, training programs, and arms dependency. Key steps. African defense industry. African countries must invest in homegrown weapons development, intelligence gathering, and cyber defense infrastructure. Continental security architecture. The African standby force must be operationalized. Regional forces should respond to crises instead of inviting Western interventions under the guise of peacekeeping. Ending dependency on foreign mercenaries. From Libya to Mali, foreign military contractors, Wagner, US AFRICOM, continue to exploit instability. Africa must develop internal solutions to internal problems. 8. Strengthening food security and agricultural sovereignty. Food is power. Africa imports over $35 billion in food annually, despite its arable land and farming history. This dependency gives the West leverage. Key steps. Modernizing agriculture. Mechanize farming. Invest in irrigation, and support agricultural startups. Africa must feed itself and export surplus, not import basic staples. Land reform. African leaders must protect smallholder farmers from land grabs and speculation by foreign corporations. Land ownership must empower citizens, not foreign investors. Agro-processing industries. Rather than exporting raw produce, build industries that process and package locally. This creates jobs and value chains. 9. Media ownership and narrative control. Africa's story is often told by others, usually negatively. Western media control fuels stereotypes, spreads misinformation, and shapes global opinion. Key steps. African media empowerment. Fund and support continental media platforms like Al Jazeera has done for the Arab world. Africa needs its version of CNN, BBC, and Netflix to control the narrative. Social media regulation with sovereignty in mind. African countries must engage with tech companies to demand accountability and transparency, while also supporting local digital creators and platforms. Cultural and creative exports. Promote African music, film, fashion, and literature globally. Nigeria's Nollywood and Afrobeats movement prove that cultural exports can shape perception and generate wealth. 10. Unity, vision, and intergenerational collaboration. African leaders must think beyond short political cycles. The transformation of a continent demands a long-term, collective vision and collaboration across generations. Key steps. 30-year African Development Plan. Leaders must co-create a binding, Pan-African 2050 agenda. Countries must align budgets, policies, and priorities to a unified development roadmap. Youth engagement. With over 60% of Africa under 25, youth must be integrated into leadership, innovation, and governance. Political structures should encourage youth participation and mentorship. Diaspora reconnection. African leaders must actively court the diaspora for skills, capital, and advocacy. The African Union should build permanent diaspora liaison structures. Africa is not poor. It has abundant natural resources, a vibrant culture, a youthful population, and a growing collective consciousness. But without decisive leadership, strategic planning, and a bold break from colonial structures, Africa will remain the world's raw material depot and a pawn in global power games. The time for half measures is over. African leaders must either rise as liberators of their people or be remembered as agents of subjugation. The path to African prosperity lies not in the West, but within, in the wisdom of our ancestors, the energy of our youth, and the unity of our purpose. Africa must now own its future, politically, economically, culturally, and spiritually. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, and share for more updates on African leadership.